Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the November edition of Practice Break here on the Mind Left YouTube channel. Today, I'm very excited for our guest because just doing research into his story and everything he has to offer has already helped me improve as a musician and helped me improve my practicing. So, Noah, for people who don't know you but should know you, please introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi. Yeah, my name is Noa Kageyama. I am a performance psychologist, but once upon a time, starting at the age of 2, I was a violinist until I made a switch after grad school to explore psychology.
Right, yeah. Let's just get started there. I think a lot of people probably will focus on the fact that you switched over from music to psychology, but I want to start off with starting music at the age of 2 because um, on your website you mentioned that you started violin in Japan, right?
I started here in the States actually, but within a few years, my mom started getting really interested in Dr. Suzuki's philosophy. And
Uh-huh.
so then we went over for, 6 to 9 months to do some studying with him there.
Also, it was a temporary thing in Japan.
Right, right.
So you had a lot of training here in America, you had a lot of training in Japan. How does it compare? Because, it's just a generalization, but classical music has this reputation for being very a very disciplined craft, and Japanese teachers have a reputation for being very disciplined. So how did that kind of feel in Japan?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm probably not going to be able to give the best answer because I was 5 when I was there, and so my memory
Yeah.
of some things may not be the most reliable. Um, I do remember, but this is true in both countries. I mean, I do remember that Dr. Suzuki himself was, very warm and kind of like a kid. I mean, he must have been in his 70s or 80s at that point already, but would get down on the ground on his knees and play game sort of with me, to try to get me to understand some of these concepts that he was trying to get me to do, and do things like put his briefcase on my elbow to help me understand the concept of using more weight in the bow and so forth. So he was very much kind of like a grown-up kid, from my recollection. Then I also studied regularly with one of his assistants, and she
Mhm.
did make me more nervous and scare me a little bit. I remember, and I do remember her being more strict. But again, same country, two different teachers, very different approaches to teaching me. And even when I came back here to the States, I've certainly had some teachers who reminded me more of Dr. Stuckey and others who reminded me more of the other teacher who scared me as well. So
Mhm. Between those two contrasting styles of teaching, which would you say is the most effective in terms of growth?
now having looked at some of the research, I could probably make an argument for one way or the other. But to be honest, I don't know that I would take any of it back, in the sense that I learned a lot from all the different teachers that I was fortunate to be able to study for, and they all had different
Mhm.
approaches. And some of it, I think, had to do with the period in which I studied with them as well. I mean, there's some teachers who, I wish I would have been able to go back and study with them later, because I think I would have gained more and understood more of what it is that they were trying to help me with. And others who were, absolutely the right teacher for what I needed at that time. And then others who, yeah, I might have encountered them a little bit too soon to really be able to grasp and appreciate what they had to offer.
Mhm. Let's say for college students, for high schoolers looking into college professors to work with, or college students looking for grad professors to work with, do you think that working with a teacher who makes you feel nervous makes you more prepared for performance anxiety because you're constantly dealing with that kind of nervousness, or do you think it has an opposite effect psychologically?
Yeah, well, we could, as you talk to psychologists, you start to notice that they often like to say it depends. Um, because even in that question, a couple things come to mind. One, certainly there are some teachers who I think, by the way, in which they might approach students, or their reputation, or the kind of esteem in which you hold them, they may naturally have more of a an effect on a student in
Hmm.
general, where students tend to be a little bit more nervous going into it. But in all fairness, a lot of it comes from the student as well. Different students have had different experiences with different sorts of teachers and are different places in their development. And so, a teacher who may not make one student very nervous might make another student very nervous, even if the teacher tries to approach both students in the same sort of way. And
Hmm.
so yeah, it ends up being kind of a complicated scenario. But in terms of being more prepared for performance, if we're assuming that the teacher isn't deliberately trying to scare the crap out of the student and make them feel terrible about their playing and themselves, but are really supportive and helpful and trying to teach the student in the best possible way and help them be prepared for whatever may be in their future career wise or performance wise. And that teacher happens to, make that student feel a little bit of nerves, to be able to have an experience from week to week where it does feel like you need to bring your A game can be a helpful way to prepare for auditions and performances and so forth. I mean, I certainly remember in grad school studying with teachers who, um, yeah, did make you feel, not because they were mean or scary or because you were afraid they would yell at you,
Hmm.
they were the most, thoughtful and, um, helpful teachers I could have asked for, but because of who they were, just the reputation and wanting to impress them just of my own volition and, my ego's sake. Yeah, I went into lessons feeling like it was an opportunity to try to play the best that I could. And I do think having that really helps, because if you don't have that, if you have a teacher who, you respect a ton, but you just feel like it's another day in the practice room going into the lesson, and it doesn't feel like it matters that much if you play really well or really poorly. uh, and if you even go and play for friends and it doesn't feel like it matters that much and you don't feel any of those nerves, and then suddenly you go to an audition and then you feel a vastly different level of pressure, and you can't replicate that or simulate any semblance of that in advance, yeah, it can be really challenging. I mean, I have some students, or I've run across musicians who, they're desperately trying to recreate some sense of nerves or jitters or pressure in advance of auditions, because they know that once they go there, it's such a different experience to them that they really struggle to figure out how to navigate it.
Hmm.
And, they try all sorts of things to try to recreate some of those scenarios. And it's tough when they can't, when they do mock auditions, they play for friends or they play for coaches or friends of friends, strangers even, who they respect, on paper and principle, and they still can't manufacture that sense of pressure and nerves. Yeah,
Hmm.
I mean, that's one of the questions I don't have great answers to when people come to me and say, how can I simulate this more effectively so that there's not as much of a gap between my experience in mock auditions and actual auditions or performances.
Hmm. So you're saying that for some people it's really hard to replicate that audition feeling. So what is the best thing those people can do if they just feel a complete difference? Maybe they do feel a little bit of nervousness in front of their teachers and their peers, but there's just a intense heightened feeling of anxiety when going into auditions. Mm, What can they do if they aren't able to really be able to replicate it, like you mentioned?
Well, part of the challenge is figuring out like why that is. Why is it that situations like recording yourself or playing for, a colleague whose opinion matters to you? Why is it that those scenarios don't elicit any of those kinds of, even a little bit symptoms of pressure or nerves? And why is it then that there is such a huge difference when you go into a situation like an audition? A lot of times we can get some clues by looking at some of those differences and figuring out, how is it that they're thinking of those scenarios, and how does that then affect, the pressure that they experience. And a lot of the research looking at trying to simulate nerves goes through a pretty typical set of ingredients. Usually it involves, um, at least in the sports realm where they've tried to manufacture nerves, usually it involves being videotaped. It involves performing a skill with some consequences involved, even if it's sort of manufactured, like a certain amount of money for the person who performs best, or some kind of punishment, sprints or something like that if you miss. Also trying to visualize a scenario in which you would feel pressure to make sure that you're thinking of it as a real performance. Like, game is tied, 3 seconds left. These free throws could either tie or win the game for you. And you just have two, shots to see if you can do that. A lot of times in these scenarios, they'll have people who are kind of important in the life of that person watching, like coaches, or in this one particular Belgian study that I'm thinking of right now, the video was going to be sent to people on the national committee who might have some say in whether these people or these athletes get to play in international level competition or not. Sometimes being aware that your video is going to be evaluated for level of performance or form or something like that can also make you a little bit more self-conscious. And then, to have your colleagues or your teammates around seeing, can we count on you in an actual game situation? So, those things aren't the same as an actual game where the outcome can make a huge difference in not just your life, but the lives of your teammates as well. But, to a degree that performance in that moment still matters. And so, yeah, trying to replicate as many of those sorts of details can be a helpful way of trying to manufacture some nerves.
Mm-hmm. On the topic of visualization, I want to know your thoughts on the opposite, using visualization when going into a performance, kind of seeing how think about things going right as opposed to things going wrong. What's your greatest advice for how you should be, what your mindset should be like going into a performance or audition?
I think, I mean, what before I even learned anything about sports psychology, my mom would have me listen to a recording of, it's Zach Perlman or whomever my favorite violinist on that piece happened to be at the time, and then just visualize myself performing.
Mm-hmm.
Hearing that sound coming out of my instrument, in the hall that we were going to be at or the venue that we would be at, and even on the drive there, just keep the tape on repeat or the CD on repeat, and ask me to continue to visualize that. And so, even if it's something very simple, that sort of assisted visualization can be a really helpful way to stay in a better headspace during a time when your mind can tend to wander to unhelpful thoughts. But one thing that can also be helpful, which I think often gets overlooked, is something that I don't remember if it was a video or a book or an article, but I remember reading, I think, that something that Michael Phelps' coach once said about how Michael Phelps used to approach visualization. And that was how he would not just visualize everything going well or going perfectly, but he would also visualize um, adversity and how he would overcome that adversity. So there's this famous story about the 2008 Olympics, I believe it was, when he won, I want to say the 200-meter butterfly, but his goggles had filled up with water at some point in the race. And so he wasn't able to see in the way that he would ordinarily be able to and want to be able to. And he won the race anyway, and people were curious about what that experience was like, and they asked me, "What was it like, swimming this big, race with your goggles all filled up with water?" And his response at one point to that question was, "It was pretty much like I imagined it would be." And he meant that literally. His coach explained, in the sense that when he does visualization, he also imagines having to swim races where his goggles fill up with water, or whatever else could happen to a swimmer that would count as adversity that you don't want happening. Like, he would envision those things too, but also imagine how he would respond to them. So I think naturally when we have those things pop into our head, backstage, it's like, oh, what if I have a memory slip, or what if this happens, what if that happens? I think we kind of leave it there, and then we don't also visualize, okay, so if that happens, this is how I would love to respond to that, or this is how I plan to respond to that. I think that can be a really helpful addition to visualization. So it's not just imagining the perfect scenario, because if we only imagine the perfect scenario, that almost never happens, right? Something goes awry, and then we're kind of taken aback, or we're not really prepared for that. And it's like, oh no, this is not how it's supposed to go. I just envisioned it going this way. And then we're kind of in our head going back and forth, kind of not arguing with ourselves, but feeling a little bit conflicted and out of sorts.
Yeah, that's a really interesting concept because all of my teachers and some resources that I've looked into have advised not thinking about what can go wrong, like verbatim. Only think
Mhm.
about like how you're gonna do well. Is there like a difference? Could you kind of be a little bit more specific about how um like maybe focusing more on like how you're gonna overcome those things as opposed to those faults themselves? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, you certainly don't want to dwell on memory slips or dwell on missing shifts or dwell on, your left hand being so cold and clammy that, feels like you're struggling the whole time. Um, but those thoughts are going to pop into, or those images are going to pop into our minds anyway. So when they do, if we then have a plan for, okay, if this happens, then I'm going to, refocus in this way, or I'm going to think about the sound that I want instead of worrying about my bow shaking, or, if the bow does shake and I feel kind of embarrassed at the end of this, really soft passage, I'm going to make sure I don't dwell on it. And instead I'm going to focus on, the sound that I want in this next passage that comes up. I'm going to focus on the way in which I want to shape this phrase and bring out this character, because that's something I've been working on, the last week. And, so having some plan for how we're going to redirect, kind of like, in meditation, where, if your goal is to focus on your breathing and then thoughts about your dog pop in, then, you don't keep thinking about the dog, like you refocus on your breathing. Or, and this is related to making mistakes, or what oftentimes you hear that the sportscasters talk about, during the games, where, they wonder how an athlete's going to respond after giving up a big play. And, they talk about how the coach is probably going to go right back at them again and see if they can catch them dwelling on that mistake, and how important it is to have a short memory and basically be able to flush that mistake out of your memory and out of your thoughts, and just refocus on, okay, what's this play? What's the next thing? How can I help my team? So,
Yeah. I like how you're using sports analogies, and I know studying a lot of sports psychology is a big part of Bulletproof Musician. Um, could you share some specific instances where the principles of sports psychology, particularly those learned in, I believe, Don Green's class at Juilliard, significantly transformed your approach to playing and practicing?
yeah, I mean, there were a ton of things that I never thought about that we learned that semester, but one that, for whatever reason, really stuck out to me most is this idea of focusing on the process and not the outcome. And, it's such a cliche now in sports. Like, like, I mean, Philadelphia 76ers, like, their whole organization was kind of focused on, the process, as they called it. But athletes now, will often talk about focusing on the process rather than the outcome. And that's sort of jargony almost at this point. But basically, the idea is, like, say in a competition or an audition, and in the semester I took that class, I was preparing for one of those international competitions where, it's multiple rounds and jury and all that stuff. And, he said that you don't have direct control over whether the judges like you or not, or whether they're going to vote for you, or, score you highly or evaluate you highly. And at first, internally I sort of resisted that. It's like, no, like, if I play really well, then I can control that and they will give me really good scores, whatnot. But then, the truth is not really, because they may not like my sound. Just like, I can't have a sound that appeals as much to every single person as it might to one person or two people, or, half of them. Or, maybe they had a really bad breakfast burrito that morning and they're not listening to any of us because they're more concerned about, are they going to be able to make it through? Or do they need to, like, kind of excuse, what I mean? Like, there's all sorts of, or might have had an argument with their significant other that morning about the garage door. And so
Mhm.
there's all sorts of things that could be happening, which could predispose them to like my playing more or less, regardless of how well or poorly I play.
Mhm.
And even the love of my playing, there's a variation from day to day, just the way the acoustics fit, our particular repertoire, or, how my hands are feeling, or, just things are different, the level of energy and fatigue and so forth. And so this idea of focusing on the process and focusing on the controllables was really liberating in a way, because it allowed me to detach more from whether I would win or whether I would get to the next round or whether I would get a lot of applause or standing ovation or just sort of like a lukewarm applause. Because as long as I felt like I was focusing on the things that I could control, I'd done everything that I could do within my realm of influence. And I was able to kind of walk away from that with a little bit more peace.
Mhm. How do you keep that focus on only things that are in your control and not letting other things like kind of slip into your mind?
Yeah, I mean, some of it is practice, of course, and it gets a lot easier with practice. But the first challenge is figuring out, well, what is that stuff anyway that I have control over? Like, what should I be focusing on when I'm playing? And that's not something that I don't think I ever really thought about prior to that. And I don't know if it's something that most of us practice very much. So things like, you talk to different musicians and it's different things, but um, a lot of brass players will focus on sound, right? So it's not listening to their sound that's coming out of their instrument, but any of your listeners might be familiar with Arno Jacobs' pedagogy, the legendary tuba player in the Chicago Symphony way back in the day. His teaching was largely centered around this idea of how important it was to focus on the concept of sound that you want, or the quality of sound, or the sound that you want coming out of your instrument, and less on the sound that's actually coming out of your instrument, because at that point it's too late to change it. Like, it's already happened and it's in the past. Um and so yeah, I mean, this does align with it's a researcher named Gabrielle Wolf, who does a lot of research on attentional focus and how that affects motor performance. And this is very much, it seems, aligned with what she has found over the years as well. But yeah, so different musicians, different people do different things. But even if it's just to stay really intently focused on the sound that you want and the shape of the phrase that you want, and the character and the mood, different people have like different cue words or different images that they imagine, and all of those things are centered around being in the present and not evaluating the performance that just happened a second ago or 3 lines ago, or worrying excessively about what's happening in 2 lines or what's coming up, in 2 measures, which isn't natural to us, because when we're in the practice room, um, we have to think about how things are going and how we sound and evaluate and critique and all those things. So it's a very important shift of attention, and one that I don't think we generally practice very much, but one that can make a really big difference if we do.
Do you think like practicing just kind of running things through in the practice room, maybe just recording it, and while recording it, you're not paying attention to your mistakes at all. You're only focusing on how you want the next notes to be good. Is that a strong technique that you'd recommend?
Yeah, that's something. Yeah, it's something that I talk a lot about when I work with somebody or we do classes or presentations, because recording yourself is great, running things is great, but if you're just running things and just recording yourself and not practicing the mental part of what you want to be doing in a performance, then it sort of ends up feeling like you're just going through the motions of running through something and recording it, but not actually practicing the attention control that you were sort of alluding to just now.
Yeah, I know personally, whenever I have to record an audition for summer festivals, pre-screenings, whatever, it's just constant stopping. It's stopping, um, and recording again. It's like really wanting it to be perfect. No, I found out about you from some friends of mine. We were carpooling to a paid orchestra job, and they talked about your newsletter, your podcast, a couple things. I've signed up for your newsletter. I'm still on the first introduction week right now. And your podcast is great. I mean, every single episode is truly life-changing in a way. Um, could you talk about what they introduced me to, which is like the concept of, I believe it's recording yourself playing 3 times in a row. Could you kind of elaborate on that concept that you introduced?
I have to confess, I don't remember that particular. Oh, okay. So when you're recording yourself playing it 3 times in a row,
Mhm.
that's something that actually okay, so quick backstory. I was at Rice just a couple months ago and just chatting with one of the recording engineers there. and he was talking about he had been sitting in to help with the audio and so forth of the presentation of the workshop, and he was talking about something he picked up working with um, a musician that he was helping to record and so forth. And how things are always better like the second time you play it,
Yeah.
or like the third time, like the first time is always a little bit rough.
Hmm.
So a lot of times in recording sessions, you'll have one take, you try it, and you've already done a few run throughs of the whole thing, and so now you're just trying to do little spots to splice those in, which you probably don't get to do because you're doing these audition tapes where they don't want you to splice things in. But for
Hmm.
professional recording, let's say that you're able to splice things in and make little edits here and there. One of the things that he said that they discovered is that if you just play it once, it's like, oh, this is a tricky passage, let's get a better take of this. You play it once, and like, all right, let's take one, let's try it again, take two, let's try it again, take three, take five, take seven, take nine. Each time you're having to reset, and like the nerves kind of kick in again, or the pressure kicks in. And um, especially as you start getting to more and more takes, you start getting more and more frustrated, and it just starts feeling more forced, and you're trying too hard, and the fluidity and the ease, it's all kind of gone out the window. And so what he explained is that what they tried is just, let's try three takes in a row without stopping in between them. So play the tricky passage once and then stop and play it second time, stop, play it a third time. Doesn't matter how it goes. You might have nailed it on the first try. Doesn't matter. Just plan. You're going to play it three times in a row just to kind of get into a rhythm. And he said, invariably, like one of those three works out pretty well, and they're able to use it. So yeah, that might be what it is, I think, that you're referring to.
Hmm. I think so. That's generally what they said. I know you talk a lot about this. The second time around is always the best. I think in one of the shorter podcasts, I know you only do 1 hour podcasts a month, and then three shorter ones. I think one of the shorter ones you were talking about like the second time around being better. Could you share for the audience how to make your performance or an audition where you're not necessarily going to run it through beforehand, so but you want it to sound like that second run through where everything's like you feel prepared in the space and you feel warmed up enough?
Yeah, this is not fun, because I think generally we want to sound good when we're practicing. And so we tend to practice in such a way that it helps us rapidly increase the level of playing that we're capable of in that moment. Right. I mean, I think we're all guilty of, you start playing something, it doesn't sound good. So we start immediately again, right? Like the first note didn't speak the way we wanted, so we'll do it again. Or, in the second measure, we mess something up. So, we make some adjustments and we fiddle around with it a little bit, and then we play it again, and then it sounds better. So what just happened is you didn't actually practice getting it right, you just practice getting it right once, and then all the other little adjustments you make, you just practice making adjustments. And so a couple things. One, I mean, this is something that one of the percussionists at the Met, Rob Knopper, did for months in advance of his audition. But he'd start off every day with a run through, right? Like, get warmed up a little bit so you're not completely cold, but then run the list of excerpts that you're working on, or run the whole first movement of the concerto, or even just the first page of the concerto without having touched it first. Because if you've touched it already, then it's sort of like cheating, right? Because then it's not really the first time. You've already kind of familiarized yourself with those notes. So almost to try to make it more extreme than it'll be in a performance, because in a performance you'll be able to warm up a little bit backstage, and you'll be a little bit more warmed up than you are at like 8 in the morning or 10 in the morning or whatever time. And so if you can nail it or get pretty close to being happy with how it sounds the very first time when you play it for yourself in the practice room, it gets easier to do that on stage. But then there's the whole idea of even just how we practice. I don't know if you've come across this yet, but increasingly in sports and motor learning, and even in music, there's been more of an emphasis on interleaved or random practice, which is where instead of just practicing the same thing over and over and over, where you only really spend a couple minutes practicing getting it right the first time, you constrain the amount of time that you spend on any one thing but come back to it multiple times in the same practice session. And I think we all know this intuitively in other areas of our life. We just don't apply it to music. But the whole reason for studying with flashcards, which happened even when I was a kid, is to practice remembering things after studying other things, right? So if you have a bunch of flashcards with physics formulas, or I don't know, like geometry formulas and such, like you're not going to look at the same flat, or even vocabulary words, right, for different language. You're not going to look at the same vocabulary card over and over and over and over, and then look at the next card over and over and over, and then never come back to the first one. The whole idea is to like keep quizzing yourself when your brain has started to forget the answer, so you can practice remembering when your brain has started, to lose that formula, or that word that you're trying to learn. And so similarly with music, practicing remembering things multiple times, just like with the flashcards in the same practice session, can help us get better at getting things right the first time, the way that we want, or closer to the way that we want the first time.
Have you ever tried or recommended students kind of like putting like a list of, let's say, spots in their repertoire and kind of shuffling it through and working on it like that?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of musicians already kind of do that, as it turns out. And uh, depending on how nerdy you want to be, there are apps that can help with that. The old fashioned manual kind of flashcard way, I think, is kind of easiest to start with, but there are apps that can help with that. If you start getting into orchestral excerpts and so forth, some musicians, have entire systems of Excel spreadsheets and Google Sheets documents with formulas and so forth that help them to identify what to spend more time on and when, and so forth. So yeah, you can get pretty nerdy about it if you want to, but just start as a principle. It's a very helpful way to just start exploring that idea. But the only thing is, it's not comfortable. Like, it's not fun to practice that way because you feel like you're struggling, which makes it feel like, oh, well, I feel like I'm struggling. I'm not getting better as quickly as I should be. This must not be working.
Mhm.
But the reality is, you won't know until tomorrow or the day after or like next week, because the whole idea is to be able to practice in such a way that our skills that we develop in practice are retained. And the only way to know if it's actually been learned or retained or not, and this is why a lot of studies in this area, it's not just a pre-test and then skill practice and then a post-test and then that's it. It's a pre-test, and then they practice a skill, and then they do another test, and then they have to go away from the lab and do other things, come back the next day or a week later or 10 days later, come back again without any further practice, and let's try this test again to see how much of that performance actually stuck, because everyone's going to be better at the end of practice. Question is, between the end of practice and the next test, how much of that still is remaining that you've gained. And that's the real test for whether practice is effective or not. So the weird time lag thing is, you're not going to know if today's practice was any good, or any it was effective or not,
Mhm.
until you run through some stuff tomorrow. But like, we don't tend to practice on that time scale. We adapt our practice methods based on, oh, does it feel like I'm improving right now, which can be, unfortunately, kind of misleading. So,
Mhm. With that interleaf practicing, it sounds like you're saying it's good to like kind of set it aside for a little bit. But let's say you're in one practice session, you have one line that's really difficult. Is it better to practice a spot or a line in the same piece, or is it better to go to a different composition that's very different?
it sort of depends on where you're at. um, because if this line is really really difficult, you may not want to leave it. You might want to do more of the traditional sort of blocked practice, as it's called.
Mhm.
Like, if I don't know, I just make it, if it's something from you know some crazy Paganini caprice that you can barely wrap your fingers around, well, you might need to spend 15-20 minutes just kind of sorting it out, and doing some of it slowly, or other various strategies to just kind of get it in your fingers first, so that the approximation of it is there,
Mhm.
um, or the basic elements of it are there. to try to switch up from that to some other difficult section of the Paganini Caprice, and then to Bach, and then to your Brahms Concerto, and then back again. Like by that time, it's sort of like with flashcards. Like if you wait too long to come back to that first flashcard that you're sort of struggling with, and you completely have no recollection for what the answer is, then that's too much time, or it's too much interference has transpired, between the initial exposure and then the next recall test. And so yeah, if it's relatively new or really tricky and like you need more time on it, then yeah, make it as easy for yourself as possible. However, if it's something that well and it's in your fingers pretty well, but it's just a little bit hit or miss and you need to work out some things and problem solve a little bit, then yeah, you can certainly introduce other pieces that might have very different physical demands, or even a different part of the same movement of the concerto that has very different demands, where it's like very quiet and controlled, as opposed to, fortissimo chords or something like that. But yeah, it just sort of depends on how much interference you can tolerate at that point of the learning process.
Thank you. I think this advice is really, really important. And I know that you've probably shared this and lots of other great tips in your blogs and your podcasts. You mentioned that the goal of your blogs is to be able to share your findings and what you've learned through your experience with those who are younger, and it's kind of like you wish you could tell your younger self something. So if you could tell your younger self something, but just one piece of advice, what would that be?
To be honest, I don't know if younger version of myself would have listened to older me, and I've thought about that often. The thing that was most transformative for me was learning how to practice for real. I spent years, I spent almost the entire time I practiced the violin or played the violin, um, basically just doing a bunch of repetitions, one after another, until it sounded better, and never really understood or thought about the concept of deliberate practice that I think now many more people are aware of. Anders Ericsson is the fellow who's most known for having coined that term and observed that top learners, top performers, top practicers approach practice very differently. And it kind of makes sense when you think about it, but I just wanted to get my practicing done. I just wanted to get better. And I knew that if I did a bunch of repetitions, my batting average did go up, but I never really figured out why things would sometimes sound better and why things would sometimes sound worse. So, just as a very simple example, the one that I use all the time is, just shifting. Sometimes shifts would be sharp, sometimes they'd be flat, and it was always kind of a crapshoot. And that was part of why I'd get nervous in performances, because I wouldn't know, like, I was working pretty well earlier today, but is it still going to work now? I don't know. And so I don't know why this happened, but at some point, in grad school, I started actually stopping after I tried something and see if I could identify why it happened and what I could do to make it better. So, instead of just shifting from first position to whatever position to play this 10th, with a E or with an F sharp, at the bottom part of the 10th. Sometimes it was in tune, sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes the chord was out of tune. I didn't know if it was, the F sharp, it was the other note. Just fudge it and, futz around with it until it sounded like it was in tune. And then like, okay, I hope I can do that again the next time. So at some point I started actually taking the time to identify, okay, well, which note was out of tune? And okay, that, let's say this note is out of tune. Well, how? Like, was it sharp or was it flat? Like, was it a lot sharp, a lot flat, just a little bit? And then why did that happen? Is it because I was pressing down too hard with my first finger? Or is it because I didn't get my elbow around soon enough? Or is it because, like the hand shape I had, maybe my fourth finger wasn't extended enough, or was it because my thumb was too tight, and so it couldn't release and get around the core of the instrument as far as I needed to. Like I never really stopped to think about all these things. But once I started stopping and thinking about those things, it did make it feel like my practice had slowed down. Like
Mm.
if you would listen to me practice earlier and then listen to me practice after I started practicing this way, you'd hear a lot more playing before and a lot less playing after. But I improved a lot more and reinforced like the wrong way much less because I was getting it right sooner, like in fewer repetitions.
Mhm.
And not only was I getting it right in fewer repetitions, but I also understood what I was doing differently. So I could do those things again, sort of like having a recipe versus not having a recipe that's printed out and you just kind of guessing. It's like, well, I don't know if it was a teaspoon or tablespoon last time. It seemed like it was like this, but setting out, like if I could get myself from a much younger age to just, slow practicing down and actually take the time to reflect after each repetition and try to identify what to do differently. I mean, that's one thing I wish I would have loved to see what difference that would have made, not just in my willingness to practice, but obviously my level of performance, and how much I would have improved over the same span of time as well.
Mm. You talk about practicing less after practicing more efficiently, and everyone talks about practicing efficiently. Of course, we all want to do that. But in one of your more recent podcast episodes, you talked about not practicing efficiently, taking breaks efficiently. And this series is called Practice Break. So I think that's really important. Can you elaborate more on taking breaks efficiently?
I think the first thing is to know when to take a break. And it's really tempting and easy to have a formula for how to practice, as in, I mean, the classic formula that I grew up with, was 50 minutes of practice and 10 minutes of break, right? And then you repeat that a bunch of times. And especially if you have classes and a school schedule, whether it's in high school or college, um, or even if you have a work schedule, there's a lot of elements in our day that we can't move around so flexibly. So it's tempting to also make our practice try to have this regimented approach too. And sometimes it's necessary, but when possible, it's nice to take a break when you're no longer focused, right? So whether it's 50 minutes in or whether it's 20 minutes in and you just realize that your mind is wandering off to completely irrelevant places, that would be the time to take a break and then try to come back to things, whether it's 5 or 10 or 15 minutes later. So first off, yeah, I mean, I think knowing when to take a break and giving yourself permission to take a break can be really useful. And I'm not sure if I remember exactly which blog post about breaks that it was, but yeah, being able to do something during your break that helps to recharge your batteries a little bit. Um, and if it's the one that I'm thinking about, it involved, going for a walk or going into a little bit of green space, whether it's a park or, just um, being able to look out the window if your practice room has a window, which I know a lot don't. But not so much hopping back on your phone to see what you'd missed in the last 50 minutes or 25 minutes, or um, doing things that make it harder to get back into the mode of practicing, because you're now distracted with all sorts of things that are more tempting for your brain to explore because they're easier and funner than solving some problem that had you stumped in the previous practice session.
Mhm. Focus. On your website, you have a mental skills profile quiz. I took that quiz and I just want to share my results with you, or at least a quick summary of it. My highest ranked one, with a score of 11, is cultivating courage. But then my lowest with a score of 5 is getting into the zone. So I think finding, like, being able to stay focused for long periods of time, because I only recently had like that amount of time. I've started college. I know for some people going into college restricts them with time, but with my high school life, I actually have had a lot more time to practice, and I've been more disciplined into setting aside the time to practice. But with that, I'm trying to practice, 3 to 4 hours a day. It's hard to stay focused for all that time. And I don't have all the time in the world. I wouldn't be able to reach 3 hours of practice if I just stopped whenever I lost focus. Um, and I like always mentally preparing myself before I go to the practice room. It's about a 15-minute walk from my dorm to the practice rooms, and I'll do a little bit of stretching and just mentally preparing myself. But I want to see if you have any advice for, we talked about mentally preparing yourself for auditions and performances, but what about just focused practice? How do you prepare yourself for that?
Yeah, a lot of times something as simple as interleave practice can help with focus because it gives you a structure to follow. Like, so for instance, if you are working on, three different movements of a concerto and you need to take it to your lesson, in a week, knowing that in a 45-minute span of time, every 5 minutes, say you're going to switch from one movement to the next and then to the next, and then you come back to it again and test out certain things. That timer being there of, okay, I have 5 minutes to try to solve this particular tricky thing. And if I can't solve it, unfortunately, I have to move on. I have to come back to it later and see if I can fix it then. Or even if you solved it in 2 minutes, you have 3 more minutes left. Oh, I have some time to start working on something else. Ooh, can I finish solving that? In the time that I have before I have to move on to the next movement. And then coming back, something about that does often help people with focus in the sense that it creates a sense of urgency around getting things done and not feeling like you have all the time in the world to just work on something.
Mhm.
But also, it can be really helpful to have specific goals for your practice time and what it is that you're trying to accomplish. And that takes time too, to establish goals and identify them and keep track and so forth. But yeah, between those types of things, having a practice strategy that constrains your time or repetition, and then also having specific goals for things that you want to get done. I wish I could, show you this visually or explain more clearly than I can. But one of my colleagues here in New York, Jason Haheim, who's the principal timpanist at the Met, um, he was an engineer before he went into an orchestra career, and worked for this nanotechnology startup in Chicago, and so very much a analytical thinker. He had a whole, because he had a day job, couldn't afford to spend all day practicing. Like, he
Mhm.
needed to be very effective with his time in the span of time that he had, and so he came up with a whole system for prioritizing excerpts. And I mean, he's one of the people I was thinking of in my mind when I mentioned Excel spreadsheets and formulas. I mean, he basically, broke down all the excerpts and figured out which ones are probabilistically the most likely to show up at various rounds, and then proportioned out his practice time that was very limited around the excerpts that needed to be in the best possible shape to win an audition. And, as he worked on them, there's a lot of recording and there's a whole process and a rating system. And, there's other folks who have done similar things. And what it does is it it very quickly makes you feel, it takes you from feeling like you have plenty of time to work on things when you look and you see these big blocks of time in your calendar, to feeling like, oh crap, like I can't afford to waste any minutes in my preparation. When you see, okay, here's where I am now, here's where these excerpts, or here's where the repertoire is, here's the audition, or here's the performance date or the recital or the jury date. If, for instance, you were to actually kind of block out between now and whenever, say, juries was in the spring or summer festival audition, and you mapped out, all the other commitments you have with class, sleep, and food, and a social life as well, and all those things, and then account for unpredictable things that are going to happen, you getting sick, etc. Like, you actually mapped out, okay, here are all the blocks of time where I can realistically practice and get things done. I think most of us very quickly discover that, oh, I don't actually have as much time as as I thought. And so we start, if we then break down, well, where do I need to be in 4 months? Where do I need to be in 3 months, in 2 months, in 1 month, and in 2 weeks from now? Where do these things have to be? It kind of ups the urgency a little bit, like not in a super stressful way, but like in a helpful way. And it makes it easier for us to identify specific goals on things that we need to get done, things we need to sort out in the time that we have. And that too then filters into the day-to-day practice sessions where it's easier to, to be able to kind of have a to-do list to be like, oh, did I get this done? Did I not get this done? Oh, if I didn't get this done, that means I am going to need to be even more efficient tomorrow or even more efficient next week. So,
Right. I mean, this is fantastic advice. You're basically teaching me and the audience how to practice. So I go after this interview and I have a really effective practice session. But then after I practice, I shouldn't just put away my instrument and go off to the next thing. In the same podcast episode about taking effective breaks, you mentioned reflection. Can we talk about reflection, how much time you should set aside for reflection after practicing, and the best way to go about that?
yeah, I don't think it has to be a ton of time. I mean, for some folks, they're doing the reflection during the practice session. After you figure out the solution to this tricky thing that's been, giving you problems for a little while, you before you move on to the next passage, like you write down what you discovered, the little micro epiphanies that you have from moment to moment. You write that down, you store that somewhere where you will be able to find it again or remember it if you need to. And so that little bit of reflection is already kind of built in to the practice process that you're already engaged in. But then after your practice session, to take a moment, even just a couple of minutes, that's, before you walk out the door, or even after you walk out the door, before you go on to the next thing, to just reflect a little bit on how you felt your practice went. You know, were you effective with your time? Did it feel like you had clear goals? Did you accomplish those goals? I would say, even if for a minute or two, you just take a moment to see, okay, how could I arrange things more effectively tomorrow? Or how can I do a better job tomorrow? Or what do I even need to really prioritize tomorrow that now I'm realizing I didn't make enough of a priority today? What did I end up working on instead that maybe I didn't need to or shouldn't have taken
Mhm.
so much time to work on it? I mean, two things come to mind. One, this is something that Jeff Huber, the Olympic diving coach that I've alluded to at various points on the blog and podcast. I mean, he would always get really excited when an athlete would come up to him later and say, coach, I've been thinking, and then would go on to explain what they've been thinking about. Because what that would tell them is that, okay, this is a kid who didn't just practice, put in the time, and then leave and not think about diving anymore. This is somebody who, thought about how practice went and was still puzzling over something and trying to figure out why those things were happening and what they could do differently. And so now they're like open to being, coached and experimenting with new things and trying new things that they hadn't before. And I'm on a bit of a break now, but I started getting involved in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu some years ago, and I noticed that some people would go through class and learn new things, um, and then they'd leave and they'd go off, and then others, like you'd see them consistently after class, like taking notes, like writing little things down, just in terms of what they learned or what they figured out or things to remember, things to try the next time. And I think that makes a difference. I mean, you see this in the gym, a lot of times too, right? Like people keeping track of, what they do and how they go, what can they do differently next time? Is this working? Do they need to make an adjustment? And I don't think it's a chore. I think it actually makes things more fun because it gets you excited about, I wonder what'll happen if I try this instead, which can make it easier a little bit, maybe, to get into the practice room again the next time and see how that things go.
Mhm. I like how this conversation's moving back to sports and how sports have so much, so many parallel, uh, things you need to work on with music. I think the biggest thing that comes to mind to me is injuries. All the time in sports, they warm up to prevent injuries, and they, make their practice intentional so that they don't get injured, just practicing even before the game starts. I want to ask, have you ever had an injury on your violin?
Yeah, I mean, there was a time, I think senior year of college and even into freshman year of, or no, senior year of high school into freshman year of college, where I did have some pain. And um, senior year of high school, I think I was more stressed out than I ever been in my life, and also actually practicing a little bit more because I had auditions that sort of made me feel compelled to practice. And so I don't know how much of it was, I mean, I hate to say psychosomatic, like I don't know how much of it was just a part of me resisting practicing more and just kind of almost making up the pain. I do remember seeing some specialists and so forth, and I do think it was sort of real. Um, but yeah, usually practicing too much was not my issue. I think probably what happened is I was practicing more than I was accustomed to all of a sudden, and doing so under a lot of pressure with a lot of like kind of just general stress with SATs and all that. And then also I think trying harder um, to play well instead of making sure I was playing more freely and releasing tension and so forth. Because I didn't learn how to release tension and how that affected my playing until like the end of college. So I might have looked like I was very relaxed as a player, but I was a lot more tense than it appeared. I think the only thing that prevented me from getting hurt is I really just didn't practice that much. Um, so it didn't affect me in the way that it would have if I was practicing more.
Mhm. Uh, do you just, this is really off topic, but do you have any tips for, what are your best tips for relieving tension when playing?
Well, this is not really my area of expertise, so I probably should defer on this to other folks who are, more equipped to answer that question. But,
Mhm.
but for me, one thing that I was told was to, um, like obviously take breaks, physically, but also, don't like save all of your most physically demanding, difficult, strenuous stuff, even though it's all difficult, like for one concentrated practice session, right? Like you want to spread that stuff out over time and alternate with other things that are less physically taxing, so that overall, you do get to it, but you're not getting to it like all in the same 30-minute or 60-minute practice session. I mean, that's, to me, I think that's one very easy way to go. But yeah, but those questions, I think, should be asked more often, but asked to somebody who's more specialized in that area.
Mm. All right, so going back to the area you are specialized in, do you think that having poor mental health when practicing, how much of a correlation does it have with your physical health?
I mean, I think it's hard to separate the two. I mean, so many of the experiences that we have are both mental and physical. Whether it's depression or anxiety, or whether we're excited and having a really good time with things. Um, One thing that I remember kind of stewing on for a little while after talking with, I believe it was Howard Nelson and Pamela Frank, who talked about this. Just the observation that you go to summer festival and suddenly you're having to go from having been on a little bit of a break after school to playing and practicing a ton, and a lot of it under some pressure with like new people around you and new repertoire, like conductors looking at you, and new teachers. And so there's suddenly a lot of stress, physically, and then also mentally, if you're feeling anxious or you're feeling like you need to prove yourself and so forth. And that's not necessarily a negative mental state per se if it's temporary, but all of that can contribute to more injuries than it would be if it was a bunch of your friends that you're already familiar with, and conductors and teachers who already know you, and respect and love what you're trying to do and so forth. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think it is hard to separate those things, and important to watch out for those things in general, because it's also not as gratifying and fun to try to do these things that are already difficult and challenging and stressful if we're not in a good place physically and mentally.
Mhm. Um, I know this interview has gone on for a while now. There's just so much to talk to you about, so I want to wrap it up soon. But um, how do you think you can use psychology to kind of relieve tension?
Can you expand on that a little bit or say a little bit more?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, while preparing for college auditions, I took a couple lessons with the assistant principal cellist of the Los Angeles Philharmonic, and tension is my biggest issue. If you couldn't tell by me talking about it for a really long time. Um, and he said it's all psychological. I think that might be a little bit of a stretch. I think there's definitely some physical things about it, but I think there is a strong argument to, the way you psychologically think while you play can affect how much physical tension you have. So I wonder what your advice as a psychologist would be on that.
Yeah, well, so this isn't even psychology necessarily, but in motor learning, one of the worst things that we can do is to try to either consciously monitor um, movement patterns that are already at the autonomous level, or try to control things that we don't normally think about, right? So, if I asked you to describe exactly how vibrato works and then do it, it's probably not going to feel as natural or look as fluid or effortless as it would if you're just doing vibrato and you weren't even thinking about it, right? So or even if I asked you to walk, down the street in front of a bunch of people while describing out loud what all the different muscles in your body were doing, like suddenly like your walking would slow down, your arm movements would look a little bit more forced or awkward perhaps. And so this tendency to overthink, which is very much, I think, psychological, that might be what um, your coach was referring to. But yeah, like when we start overthinking things, we start constraining degrees of freedom and moving differently than we would if we weren't thinking about it. And if we were just focused on, this goes back to Gabrielle Wolf's research, where you want to focus on the goal of your motor movements as opposed to the motor movements themselves. There are times during the learning process where, yeah, I think it's probably going to be helpful to focus on the motor movements themselves. And, like me understanding that I need to release my thumb and make sure I'm not pressing down too hard with my first finger. Otherwise, the shift is going to be consistently flat. At some point, yeah, you have to understand that. But when you're doing the shift, if I'm thinking, okay, release my thumb this much here, make sure to get my elbow here, and then first finger like this, then the shift's going to be over before I'm able to kind of consciously walk myself through every single thing that has to happen. So yeah, there's a time and a place for that sort of thing. But in terms of tension and it affecting our playing, beyond the skill of being able to play more freely and release the right amount of tension in the right places at the right time, making sure we're not overthinking things is also an important part of that equation.
Mm. I want to shift the conversation back to your education and how you went to graduate school for psychology. When you made that decision, did you have intention of focusing on music psychology, or were you kind of interested in exploring just various areas of psychology?
Well, at the time, we talked about at the very beginning today how I started when I was 2, and it was, you know, at least on the outside, very serious about music and devote a lot of time and energy and resources, parents and so forth into it. And so the only way I could justify doing something else was if it didn't mean wasting, in my mind, wasting all the time and energy and resources that had gone into getting me to that point. And so yeah, the short answer to your question is I always intended to, focus on performance psychology, but apply it specifically to musicians, because that way I could use the things that I had learned over the years, but also learn and be engaged in this other field and kind of end up blending them together. So that was always my goal. I didn't know if it was going to work out or not. I was open to the fact that it might go in a different direction. But I think at the time, what really helped me make that pivot is the assumption that it would still tap into everything that I learned up until that point.
Mhm. We're kind of going in reverse order here. I'm gonna kind of introduce myself a little bit right now here at the end of the podcast. But I was a declared music performance and psychology double major, and I actually decided on switching that to a minor because I felt like I wanted to spend more time focusing on music. And psychology was kind of more of a side hobby for me. Did you have interest in psychology before attending Juilliard?
Not really, to be honest. And this is a longer story that we don't need to get into, but I was actually a psych major at Oberlin, where I did my undergrad studies. But I did that. The short version of the story is I did that to basically get out of all the music classes and stuff that I didn't want to take. And I figured psychology would be, you know, I don't know, easy enough or something. Turned out not to be so easy, but I also wasn't that serious about it. And I actually didn't really find it all that interesting. And fully intended to go into music. And so went to Juilliard, like I'd kind of planned all along. And that's where I took that class with Don Green, who was teaching a class on sports psychology. And that I'd never heard of before, because that, back in the 90s wasn't a major part of, all these other aspects of psychology, social, developmental, cognitive, like all that is what you focus on in undergrad, right? Sports psych was this sort of niche area that wasn't kind of a core part of the psychology research field. So yeah, so I was sort of pleasantly surprised to discover that, oh, hey, here's a type of psychology that I actually find really interesting and useful. So
All right. Thank you so much, Noah. Just one last question before we end this. Hopefully, I memorized your credentials correctly. You can correct me if I'm wrong. Faculty at Juilliard, faculty at Cleveland Institute of Music, and New World Symphony. Um, is there more to that? I mean, that's already really insane, but
no, that's
that's
a
the
good
main,
that's
right?
a good, yeah.
Yeah. So you work with a lot of students. What is the most common problem you see among them? And what is your solution to anyone else who might be dealing with that?
Well, I think the thing that everybody, regardless of level, whether they're, 12, whether they're, 22 finishing up college, whether they're, 72 an adult learner, whether they're, in a professional orchestra, whether, they're teaching. I think the thing that everybody comes to me for is help with nerves and that gap between practice and performance. They think that the problem there is the nerves, and that certainly is a factor in the equation. But more and more, I think the thing that I find myself working on most is attention control, like how to stay focused in the right sort of way in the moment of performance, so that whether you're nervous or whether you're not nervous, because you can be nervous and play well, and you can be calm and play poorly. I think we've all had those ranges
Absolutely.
of experiences. And so yeah, increasingly I think, for me it's been about attention control and like figuring out how to stay focused in the right sort of way to be able to get into the zone and have those good days and then stay in the zone and not realize you're in the zone midway through performance and then suddenly not be able to get back there again. So
Right. Thank you so much, Noah. This interview did not disappoint. Everyone, I'm gonna put Bulletproof Musician's website in the description, and I highly encourage everyone to at least sign up for the email list. The email list every single week has great advice. And if you have time, also check out the podcast. Noah, any final comments you'd like to make?
no, I think that's good. I mean, the one thing I was curious about is how the 1 week practice challenge has been going for you, the little buffet of different practice strategies.
It would be going well if I started it. Uh,
Got it.
I'll start it. I'll start it. I will actually start it, and I'll post about it on my practice account. So
Sounds good.
yeah, yeah. Thank you again, Noah, and thank you everyone for watching.